An extraordinary phenomenon unfolded upon the Milanese rink during that afternoon. It wasn't a tumble or a glaring error. It was far more subtle. Initially, just a handful of observers caught on. Within the stadium, gentle illumination shimmered against the frozen surface. Spectators were barely finding their places, coats shuffling as scattered chatter bounced around the bleachers. Yet, right by the scoring table, a single adjudicator edged closer to the glass, closely followed by a second. It was an incredibly faint shift, a mere twitch that the average spectator would completely miss unless their eyes were locked on the officials. However, veteran enthusiasts of the sport instantly decode such tiny cues. A specific detail had snagged their focus. Dead center on the frozen stage waited Ilia Malinin. Motion remained minimal for now. He merely drifted at a leisurely pace, wrapping around the perimeter, feeling out how his steel bit into the frost. A modest thrust, a smooth arc, followed by a second swoop. Competitors routinely perform this ritual prior to their audio track kicking in. It allows them to gauge the friction and acclimate to the chilling stadium air. Yet, a peculiar energy surrounded the deliberate manner in which this particular champion measured his strides. There was zero urgency in his demeanor. Anybody familiar with his typical explosive style knows exactly how bizarre that behavior is. Over the past couple of years, the Phenom has forged a legendary status so wild, it borders on absolute fiction for uninitiated ears. Supporters dubbed him the Quad God, no irony intended, strictly based on his gravity-defying feats. He etched his name in the history books as the inaugural athlete to conquer the Quadruple Axel during an official tournament, an aerial maneuver requiring 4.5 dizzying twists while suspended above the ground. A concept debated by experts for generations, yet almost never pursued with genuine intent. Simply put, his entire legacy rests upon velocity, sheer force, and unthinkable aerial spins. Despite that explosive pedigree, he currently prowled the arena with a creeping, highly calculated slowness. Tucked away past the broadcasting equipment, several journalists had spent the morning trading hushed rumors. It lacked theatrical flair, serving mostly as low-key gossip. Word on the street claimed the superstar had overhauled his performance far beyond minor adjustments, but rather a massive shift. An elite trainer from Europe, having observed the early warm-up block, allegedly remarked that the choreography carried an entirely distinct vibe. The seasoned mentor offered no judgment on its quality, merely emphasizing its sheer unfamiliarity. Based on that insider account, the rehearsal featured a specific sequence where the entire tempo morphed, completely abandoning the traditional pacing expected in high-stakes tournaments. Remarks like that tend to linger heavily in the consciousness of observers. After all, top-tier ice choreography generally relies on a highly formulaic blueprint. Instructors engineer every single second with agonizing precision to bleed every possible fraction of a score from the judges, front-loading the leaps, bunching up complex maneuvers, and heavily regulating the skater's stamina. However, the whispers hinted that Malinin had entirely scrambled the foundational DNA of his set. Right on cue, the soundtrack kicked in. A deep, resonant bass note flooded the stadium sound system, completely defying the standard orchestral overtures most competitors lean upon. The audio possessed a contemporary movie score quality, methodically swelling in tension rather than erupting with sudden power. The prodigy propelled himself forward, carving an expansive semicircle across the frozen expanse. Not a single leap occurred. 30 seconds vanished, followed closely by 40. A palpable hush fell over the gathered masses as the collective realization dawned that they were witnessing a complete departure from the norm. Typically, at this stage in the music, any athlete famous for jaw-dropping acrobatics would already be gaining maximum velocity for their opening trick. Defying expectations, the superstar hit the brakes once more, stretching into an endless glide, adding a spin, and riding another edge. High above in the bleachers, a muted voice murmured, "What on earth is his plan?" The confusion visibly bled over to the evaluator's table. A scorer nervously peeked at their planned content paperwork. A colleague nudged their spectacles higher, throwing a puzzled gaze back toward the rink, realizing the visual cues wholly contradicted the submitted technical blueprint. Suddenly, the skater transferred his entire center of gravity to his left outer blade. Twisting his torso, he snapped his physique into a definitive launch posture. To any spectator, well-versed in the physics of championship-level blade work, it was undeniably apparent he was finally priming his inaugural leap. Yet, the approach trajectory appeared wildly incorrect, bluntly abbreviated, and alarmingly straightforward. For a fleeting heartbeat, every soul inside the facility seemingly gasped and froze. If that specific carve on the frosty surface indicated what the experts feared, then this young titan was ditching the predictable opening maneuver entirely. He was winding up for an entirely different beast, a trick absolutely zero spectators had ever witnessed him try under these lights. That terrifying epiphany radiated across the audience, sweeping through the rows like a shockwave. A profound, unnatural tranquility briefly swallowed the cavernous stadium. It was a suffocating quiet birthed not from mere absence of noise, but fueled entirely by electric, nerve-wracking suspense. The masses intuitively felt history fracturing, even lacking the vocabulary to articulate the anomaly. Dead in the middle of the rink, Ilia Malinin locked in that brutally sharp approach and hit the gas. He didn't sprint. He commanded the ice with absolute restraint. His torso remained unnervingly still as his legs quietly generated explosive torque. That specific nuance carries a massive amount of weight, far beyond what casual fans could ever grasp. At the pinnacle of the sport, legends manufactured terrifying velocity while appearing utterly effortless. The Phenom had conquered that delicate illusion long ago, yet this current wind-up felt alien. Under ordinary circumstances, whenever he gathers momentum for a monumental aerial assault, his runway consumes a massive, sweeping diagonal slice of the venue. True diehards can literally map out his flight path before he even leaves the ground. That smooth coast, the sudden shift of the blade, the violent burst into the air. He took a much tighter, more aggressive approach this round. Over at the official's desk, a technical expert dropped their pen, scooting to the edge of their seat. You see, only a handful of aerial feats in this entire discipline demand a setup quite like that, and one specific maneuver comes with catastrophic stakes. Dropping his weight, the skater coiled his body, snapping his arms tight against his chest. And just like that, he achieved liftoff. The sheer velocity of his departure meant half the crowd blinked and missed the launch, only spotting him once he was already a blur of motion overhead. Suspended above the frozen surface, he morphed into a dense missile, shoulders completely rigid, legs squeezed perfectly together as he whirled. Revolution followed blistering revolution. It was the kind of dizzying velocity that leaves veteran broadcasters completely unable to tally the spins in real time. Our brains just aren't wired to process visual data at that frequency, though the adjudicators were keeping a razor-sharp gaze fixed on him. That is literally their job. As gravity reclaimed him, his steel caught the frozen floor, sending a harsh, tearing sound ringing throughout the entire stadium. A delicate cloud of shaved ice puffed into the air. Absolutely flawless execution. Yet, the massive venue sat in dead silence. What followed was a bizarre, suspended heartbeat of sheer disbelief, that fleeting instant where thousands of brains desperately attempt to verify the impossible spectacle they just witnessed. Finally, the roaring ovation broke through. It wasn't a sudden blast of noise, but rather a surging tide rolling through the bleachers as the sheer magnitude of the feat truly sank in. Why? Because that initial trick alone catapulted the performance's benchmark way past what most competitors would dare dream of trying. And we weren't even 60 seconds into the routine. Yet, the young phenom offered zero fist pumps. His expression remained utterly stoic. Fans and critics alike always point out this chilling quality, while ordinary athletes use a massive success to catch their breath, soak in the cheers, and dial back into the zone. This kid just blasts immediately into his next sequence, and he did precisely that without skipping a beat. Slicing through a fiercely intricate pattern of footwork, he let the artistic flair of the dance seamlessly bleed into the harsh, demanding physics of the sport. Rapid pivots, lightning-fast weight shifts, and a dramatic reach of his hands that perfectly hit the crescendo of the backing track. If you paid close attention, a hidden genius was unfolding on the floor. This wasn't merely a brutally hard performance. Its very DNA was utterly unorthodox. Rather than stacking every single massive point-scoring leap into the usual, expected timeframes, the choreography violently threw them out like curveballs, dropping major tricks exactly when nobody was bracing for them. It was a terrifying roll of the dice. Officials score seamlessness just as heavily as raw skill, and a jerky timeline can wreck the entire vibe. Over by the barrier, a rival country's mentor was glaring at the ice, calculating. That veteran had likely analyzed hours of the skater's past tape, yet this brand new layout threw every single one of those scouting reports right into the trash. Hitting center ice, he cranked up the throttle once more. There was no hiding the sheer momentum this round. 3 explosive kicks down the straightaway, followed by a vicious crossover step. You could physically listen to his steel aggressively carving up the frozen deck, generating terrifying power for whatever came next. All around the arena, fans instinctively shifted to the edge of their chairs. His physical posture gave away the plot. You didn't need to be an encyclopedia of skating terminology to feel the heavy, mounting dread in the room. A slight slump in his upper back gave it away, a dead giveaway that die-hard analysts know all too well. It was the universal tell for an impending launch, signaling an aerial stunt packed with infinitely more danger than his opening salvo. Like a coiled spring snapping loose, he went completely airborne. His spinning form blurred so aggressively that everyone in the building subconsciously stopped breathing, terrified of the outcome. Down at the official booth, a scorer leaned over and muttered a quick aside to their colleague, keeping the volume too low for nearby mics to catch. But their wide-eyed glare screamed that history was happening. Because if their eyes weren't playing tricks on them regarding those airborne revolutions, then Malinin had literally just dropped the sport's two most nightmarish maneuvers into the very first chapter of his performance, and the clock had barely started ticking. Up in the rafters, the roar of the crowd intensified. But riding right beneath that wall of sound was a creeping wave of bewilderment. The masses were finally waking up to the fact that this wasn't merely a showcase of raw power. The whole thing was designed like a complex riddle, and the most mind-bending surprises were potentially still waiting in the wings. Right as the digital timer ticked past the 1-minute threshold, the entire atmospheric pressure in the stadium seemed to warp. The cheering hadn't stopped, and the electric buzz was as potent as ever. Yet an underlying current of deep fascination took root. The established rulebook of how these performances operate was being shredded right before the eyes of seasoned fans. At the elite level of this sport, athletes usually stick to a highly predictable formula. Mentors mathematically engineer these runs to squeeze every single point out of the judges without draining the skater's gas tank. But witnessing Ilia Malinin tear across the rink, it was obvious he had completely rewritten that sacred blueprint. Coasting deep into the distant curve of the boards, he tapped the brakes just a fraction, never coming to a dead halt, merely recalibrating his focus. Right then, a broadcast lens captured a microsecond of truth that the screaming fans in the building completely overlooked. He shot a lightning-fast glance directly at the VIP scoring table, barely a flicker that preserved his total immersion, yet absolutely proving he was hyper-aware of his audience. And with that, the backing track completely shifted gears. A deeper, thunderous bass line suddenly swelled beneath the delicate tune, giving the music an undeniable heartbeat. The entire mood shifted instantly. This was no longer a standard competitive skate, but a cinematic narrative playing out on the ice. The young athlete dropped his weight and surged ahead with renewed fury. 3 explosive pushes, then 4. The stadium echoed with the vicious, satisfying crunch of steel carving deep into the frozen surface as his velocity multiplied. High up in the bleachers, a pocket of American supporters began driving the beat with their hands, hungry for the next gravity-defying climax. Yet the skater withheld the anticipated launch, diving instead into a blistering maze of footwork that slashed a diagonal path from corner to corner. It was a dizzying blur of razor-sharp pivots and lightning-fast transitions, demanding a slowed-down playback just to comprehend the sheer technical wizardry at play. While airborne acrobatics usually steal the spotlight from grounded maneuvers, the adjudicators scrutinize every millimeter, and this particular labyrinth felt diabolically complex. Down at the rink-side tables, an evaluator furiously dashed an observation across their paperwork. Beside them, a colleague squinted into the playback screen, realizing this intricate dance was far more than mere artistic filler. It was a calculated, breathless trap. Without so much as a microsecond to recover from the blinding footwork, the skater violently vaulted right into a fresh takeoff. Once more, his flight path felt startlingly unconventional, compact, and brutally efficient. The instant steel left the ice, he snapped into a blinding blur of revolutions. 1, 2, 3, 4. He hit the ground flawlessly, though the sheer momentum forced his skate to carve a longer, lingering trace before finally anchoring. It was a millimeter-level adjustment, subtle enough to escape the casual viewer, but glaringly obvious to the purists in the arena. At this stratosphere of competition, such tiny visual cues speak volumes, broadcasting the horrifying kinetic impact the athlete's joints had just swallowed whole. Yet the prodigy never broke stride, sweeping his arms outward in perfect harmony with the soaring track before snapping them back into a combat-ready stance. We were not even halfway through the program, yet the sheer saturation of world-class technical difficulty felt completely suffocating. Right at that breathless juncture, a fascinating ripple of energy washed over the official scoring row. A senior technical expert snapped their gaze away from the monitors, locking eyes with a neighbor in silent, wide-eyed astonishment. They weren't panicking, they were awestruck. The architectural layout of this performance was breaking every established rule. This skater wasn't just throwing hard tricks at the wall. He was weaving absolute nightmares into the choreography, weaponizing the pacing so the evaluators couldn't blink for even a fraction of a second. The traditional ebb and flow was dead. Every 30 seconds threatened to unleash another devastating, highlight reel explosion without a shred of warning. That electric apprehension bled into the grandstands like wildfire. Thousands of spectators shifted to the absolute edges of their chairs. A sea of glowing mobile screens rose into the air, desperate to immortalize the magic. Even total newcomers to the ice realized they were witnessing an alien, rule-shattering masterpiece. Then, the entire stadium's oxygen seemingly evaporated. He swept back into the heart of the arena, telegraphing a preamble that every die-hard fan immediately recognized. The sprawling runway, the agonizingly steep angle of the blade, the terrifying velocity. Anyone who knew his dangerous repertoire recognized the predatory crouch. This was the signature launch sequence for his most impossible aerial feats. The colossal venue fell into a graveyard silence while the symphony roared, and as the skater coiled his muscles tight for flight, an identical, electrifying realization struck the brains of multiple adjudicators simultaneously. Should this kid actually pull the trigger on the airborne leviathan he was currently winding up for, this single performance would instantly vault into an echelon of mathematical insanity that veteran graders might never witness twice in their lifetimes. A collective gasp caught in the throats of thousands. A singular, unspoken truth bound the entire arena together in that heartbeat. The impending liftoff would definitively prove if this young conqueror was truly unhinged enough to unleash the most lethal layout in history. Reality narrowed down to a single patch of ice. The residual hum of thousands of voices vanished, leaving a heavy, absolute void. You could hear a pin drop, not a jacket rustled, not a floorboard creaked. A massive ocean of humanity locked their vision onto one solitary focal point. And right there, gathering catastrophic momentum, was the phenom himself. The mounting orchestral crescendo felt like a physical weight pressing against the chest. The beat quickened its pace, transforming into a relentless, driving engine that propelled the skater toward his destiny. He devoured the distance with massive, sweeping glides, shredding fresh gashes into the battered frost. An intricate web of white scars intertwined beneath the blinding stadium glow. Suddenly, the lethal setup began. To those who worship the brutal physics of this discipline, the body language was screaming its intent. The harsh tilt of his upper torso, the perilous locking of his pelvis against the frozen arc, the violent, loaded spring in his knees. He was arming the detonator for the most treacherous aerial assault known to man. Diehards in the front rows physically recoiled in anticipation, fully aware of the physics-defying nightmare about to unfold. The ice shattered as he erupted toward the rafters. For an agonizing microsecond, time froze, painting his silhouette against the blinding overhead beams. The tornado started the millisecond his steel left the ground, a viciously compact whirlwind. He violently crushed his arms to his chest to maximize the velocity. 1, 2, 3, 4. Veteran broadcasters usually fail spectacularly when trying to tally that kind of dizzying airborne math live. It's simply too violently fast for the naked cornea to process without technological aid. Yet the grim-faced adjudicators sitting rink-side weren't relying on guesswork. Every official locked onto his form mid-flight. The precise angle of his launch, the sheer altitude, and his posture in the air. These microscopic fractions of a second meant the difference between a pristine score and a devastating deduction. Gravity finally reclaimed Malinin, his steel runner carving into the frozen surface with a violent echoing hiss. He fought for the touchdown. It wasn't flawlessly aligned, skidding just a fraction wider than perfection demanded before he locked it down with absolute authority, sending the entire stadium into absolute hysterics. This was no polite clapping, it was a sheer wall of sound. The unmistakable, deafening thunder that only happens when thousands of people simultaneously witness a near-impossible feat conquered under unimaginable stress. Yet, the prodigy offered no triumphant gestures, no celebrated fist pumps, nor a single shift in expression. He simply carved forward, deadpan and driven. His icy detachment somehow magnified the sheer magnitude of the feat, projecting a terrifying reality. Pulling off the impossible was just another Tuesday for him. Meanwhile, down at the scoring panel, the atmosphere told an entirely different story. A judge leaned intensely toward the technical specialist, whispering something with profound urgency. Beside them, another official frantically scrolled through the digital playback monitor, finally comprehending the architectural madness of the performance unfolding before them. Malinin had casually dropped a trio of jaw-droppingly perilous jumps into the opening minutes, a suicidal gamble almost no elite competitor would ever dare attempt. By standard choreographic logic, champions typically hoard their most brutal aerials for the final act, desperately chasing the mathematical bonus points awarded for deep program fatigue. That method offers a calculated statistical safety net, yet this skater was clearly playing a completely different game altogether. He was stacking his deadliest weapons right out of the gate, though without a hint of recklessness. Every transition bled beautifully into the melody, yet carried such a ferocious pace that the entire performance felt dangerously unscripted. Out under the glaring spotlights, the rhythmic tempo abruptly transformed once more. He bled off his momentum, spiraling into a dizzying pirouette where his steel runner etched a microscopic halo into the frozen surface while his silhouette became a blur. Flinging his unanchored limb wide before violently whipping it close to his chest, he offered a mesmerizing, grounded counterpoint to the sky-high detonations he had just unleashed. Ground-level rotations almost never command the same roaring adulation as soaring acrobatics. Yet this specific sequence was a vital survival tactic. It was a chance to gulp oxygen. No matter how superhuman the gladiator, they absolutely require a split second to let their nervous system recover from the brutal shockwaves of repeated, multi-revolution crashes. For a fleeting handful of heartbeats, the electrified stadium caught its collective breath as the soundtrack melted into a gentler melody. Unwinding from the blur with a masterfully disguised shift in his blade's angle, he sailed smoothly toward the far shadows of the arena. The 50% mark had officially been crossed, but a bizarre psychological shift was rippling through the grandstands. Rather than exhaling after surviving the early onslaught of aerials, the audience grew intensely rigid, collectively decoding the terrifying breadcrumbs his choreography was leaving behind. The most catastrophic, physics-defying stunts weren't in the rearview mirror at all. The true nightmare was waiting in the second half. Down in the scoring trenches, an evaluator literally dropped their pen onto the desk, utterly transfixed as the skater fired up his engines and tore across the glassy expanse once more. A fleeting, silent conversation passed between two officials through nothing but wide-eyed stares. It wasn't panic, nor was it puzzlement. It was pure, unfiltered awe. Because if this architectural blueprint truly climaxed the way it was currently foreshadowing, then the prodigy hadn't just engineered a brutal challenge. He had forged a suicidal masterpiece that continuously cranked up the dial of danger. The impending sequence would brutally determine if such a brazen, escalating gamble could survive the crushing, soul-breaking gravity of ultimate competition. Past the midpoint of the marathon, the atmospheric pressure inside the venue mutated completely, leaving mere enthusiasm far behind. It morphed into a suffocating, electrifying anxiety, the specific brand of dread that hooks a crowd when they sense a once-in-a-generation spectacle unfolding right before their eyes. Gliding atop the frozen stage, Ilia broke out of his rotational lull and immediately ignited his footwork. His lungs were visibly demanding more oxygen, betrayed by the frantic, heavy, rising and falling of his shoulders as he snapped his spine back into perfect alignment. This biological tax was inevitable. Deep into a gauntlet stuffed with dizzying aerial acrobatics, sheer exhaustion always comes to collect its dues. No matter how Herculean the athlete, they feel every crash. Each touchdown blasts a violent kinetic tremor from the cold steel through the ankles, shattering upward into the knees and spinal column, and he had already swallowed multiple bone-rattling hits. Defying logic, his velocity began to fiercely multiply. He slashed a diagonal path through the arena with razor-sharp, violently efficient thrusts, refusing to waste a single ounce of kinetic energy. From the waist up, he was a statue of absolute tranquility, while his legs fired like pistons, a masterclass in isolation that die-hard purists instantly revere. That rigid core discipline is literally the razor's edge separating glorious triumph from a devastating wipeout. Meanwhile, the symphony swelled into a frantic crescendo, audibly screaming that the next death-defying trick was merely seconds away. This specific launch sequence, however, felt ominously premeditated. He carved an aggressively wide, sweeping trajectory, riding the sheer angle of his blade across the entire longitudinal stretch of the ice. His lean into the surface was violently sharper than anything he had showcased thus far, the ultimate telltale sign. The final warning siren blared when he snapped his arms inward a fraction of a second sooner than standard protocol dictated. A scorer instantly shot forward in their chair, while a neighboring official violently yanked their eyes away from the digital readout. The stakes just skyrocketed. He coiled his entire frame like a loaded spring before detonating off the surface, achieving a truly astronomical vertical leap that stole the room's breath. Launching significantly closer to the rafters than any of his prior attempts, he bought himself a precious handful of milliseconds in the abyss to conquer the twists. And the spin was an absolute blur, a viciously tight, hyper-controlled tornado of human anatomy. He crashed back to Earth with a triumphant, ear-piercing slash of metal, the blade kissing the frost and surfing the icy crust in absolute defiance of gravity. For one breathless heartbeat, that razor edge teetered on the absolute brink of disaster. Yet Malin wrenched it back from the abyss. A microscopic shift in his hips, a phantom sway of that trailing leg, pure instinct taking over. And just like that, the ice was his again. The stadium erupted in a shockwave of thunderous cheers. That deafening roar wasn't merely praise, it was sheer, unadulterated relief, bleeding from a crowd that knew exactly how close tragedy had lurked. Refusing to miss a beat, our champion surged forward, melting seamlessly back into the mesmerizing rhythm of his routine. That relentless momentum spoke volumes. Mere mortals would have taken a breath, letting their racing hearts slow down after cheating a fall. But he never took his foot off the gas, signaling a terrifying truth. The most brutal hurdles of this performance were still lying in wait. Down in the shadows of the judges' table, the primary technical expert scrutinized the terrifying blueprint flashing across their monitor. His master plan was glaringly obvious now. Throwing the classic, slow-burn choreography out the window, he rejected the gentle climb to a grand finale, instead choosing to trap himself in a boiling crucible of relentless intensity from start to finish. No places to hide, no moments to catch his breath. Just a savage gauntlet of gravity-defying feats, woven together by razor-thin threads that offered absolutely zero mercy or rest. In the cold, calculating eyes of the scoring system, playing this game was a dangerous dance with the devil. Hit every mark, and his point total would shatter the stratosphere. But if exhausted legs triggered a single slip late in the game, this entire masterpiece would burn to ashes. Up in the bleachers, the suffocating suspense was becoming contagious. The rhythmic clapping between jumps began to pulse with a frantic, desperate energy. Staccato cheers pierced the air, mingled with the anxious chuckles of fans bracing for impact, all while the swelling soundtrack promised something monumental. Carving his path toward the distant boards, the skater ignited a blistering sequence of crossover steps. He sank deep into his knees, his entire frame tilting into the frozen arc like a predator hunting its prey. For anyone who knew his playbook, the warning signs were flashing red. This violent burst of speed wasn't the prelude to some simple, safe maneuver. This was the signature wind-up for a breathtaking stunt, the absolute crown jewel meant to immortalize the entire performance. Plunging into that last, fateful curve before launching into the air, a silent realization gripped the stone-faced experts at ringside. Should his skates find purchase after whatever impossible feat he was attempting, this spectacular Milan evening would transcend the mere concept of difficulty. It would etch itself into history as a completely different beast altogether, a paradigm-shattering masterpiece destined to drag the seasoned veterans of the sport into a radical new era of competitive artistry.